certificates. And this is another one of my ongoing series of interviews with subject matter experts throughout the world talking about college, students, parents, and all the things that we deal with on a daily basis. And today I have with me a good friend, Jed Applerouth. Dr. Jed Applerouth is the founder and CEO of Applerouth Tutoring, and he has done many things. He has done a lot of work and research. Jed, we're so glad to have you. Welcome.
Thank you, Cyndy. Glad to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. Give us a little bit of insight into your background and what brought you to this point of founding your own company on test prep.
Well, I did some tutoring in high school and then in college when I was at Penn, and I enjoyed it very much. After I finished college, I went and taught fifth grade out in New Mexico for the AmeriCorps program for a year. I enjoyed that. And after I tried a couple of years in the consulting world, I realized I wanted to change. And I began painting a good bit, and I realized that's my art in the background here. And I started to just do tutoring on the side back in '01. And it turned out that the market was very excited about my tutoring, even more than my artwork. So I began doing more and more tutoring. And then eventually I was so overwhelmed with business, I had to hire tutors. And eventually this thing began to grow. Tutors moved. I followed them to new cities. And then, a decade later, we're a national business. So it was somewhat of happenstance and just following where the market, goes. And one thing I did do is when I started tutoring kids, I began to realize there was so much more to this than the academics. I began to learn that students were having problems at home and issues outside of their schoolwork. And I went back for a degree in counseling back in '04. And so I really learned some of the therapeutic side of education. And then when I finished that degree, I said, you know what, things are going well, let's stay in this game. And I signed up for a PhD in ed psychology. And that totally transformed my perceptions of student learning, of human learning, and how to really help kids learn things more effectively.
And so, I know as part of that, you've done a lot of research on learning and how students learn and how they deal with anxiety. So how have you applied that as you've worked with students, and what do you see, for your students? Can you elaborate on some of that a little bit?
Absolutely. When it comes to anxiety, performance on any kind of a high-stakes test or any other high-stakes assessment is going to be about self-regulation as a key aspect of that. There's the content, what do I know? But also in that moment of stress, can I recall, can I use what I know in a skillful fashion? And that's something that became very apparent, that there were kids who mastered the content. They knew the stuff, but they'd go in there when when it actually counted, it was official. And all of a sudden, they're dealing with a whole different level of stress. Their working memory failed them. They were freaking out during the tests, and their scores reflected some of these challenges. So probably a good 10 years ago, I began playing with some of my training therapeutically in terms of how to help clients with their anxiety. Can I bring that to this space of education? The answer was absolutely yes. The same techniques, in terms of helping people learn self-mastery, helping people learn from using their breath and using their body and their posture and their, some of the cognitive behavioral interventions, looking at your cognitions and your self-talk. And, fearful, negative-oriented self-talk can have a complete effect on your performance, as well as, your working memory, your recall during a test. And all of a sudden, time that should be going to reading and math problem solving is going towards thinking about, oh God, I'm screwing this thing up. What happens if I don't do well in this test and I'm not going to go to the college I want? And there's this cognitive interference that takes place. And the name of the game is learning how to quiet that voice, how to respond to that voice, and refocus yourself using breathing, using your body, using your cognitions, and helping kids practice. How do I practice when I miss a problem? What thoughts might manifest, and how do I have let me plan on that now and drill that so when it actually happens in a test, I've laid down the groundwork for a different pathway versus, I missed two problems, I'm freaking out, and I start going down the drain versus stop, recenter myself, okay, some positive, some mantras, some reframing of that, and then get back to work. So it really is the drilling with kids and practicing that high stress kind of condition to get them more ready when they're actually in the testing room.
So what do you counsel parents in terms of how should they help their children? Do they contribute to the problem, or are there ways that they can do to help,
Sure.
ease the problem a little bit?
I mean, typically I see when, with this generation of students, when the parents are overly involved, and some of the kids are feeling pressure from their parents, and I've seen students literally leave the test center in tears, and just on 3 different occasions when they were so jacked up on the pressure of performance on the assessment, not only for admissions but also for scholarships. That if they weren't going to hit this number, they couldn't afford college. It was going to all fall apart. And some of that pressure did come from from the parents, with whether it was direct or it was just inferred from the students. So part of it is helping coach parents on how to be supportive, without turning that support and nurturing support into pressure, because the students will definitely internalize that pressure from the parents, and it's, you want to coach them, you want to cheer them, you want to celebrate their victories, but in terms of talking about negative outcomes, and if you don't do this, then this, those kind of thoughts can really be, I would say, quite negative for students. And so I tell parents to back off, let them own this process, let them own this, and just support them in what they're doing. But be very careful about putting in place some of the negative, fearful stuff, which the kids can't totally internalize.
I like how you phrase that, to be supportive without pressure, because I think sometimes parents don't realize that it's translating into pressure. And so that needs, and their students aren't communicating that. So it leads to a conversation about communication.
Yeah.
What do you recommend to parents and students about that aspect?
And communication, I mean, I tend to lean on some of the other researchers in the field in terms of Dweck and Duckworth, and we're talking about the growth mindset component of this is a learning process, versus the outcome performance based, really focusing on the work, and in terms of encouraging the effort, encouraging them to stick with it, and be resilient, versus focusing on failures or focusing on disappointments. Focusing on, if things don't go well, it's an opportunity to, okay, what did we learn?
Right.
How can we improve? How can we build upon this? Versus really showing, having stigma or shame when there's a setback. And the students are totally looking to the parents to interpret that. The same as even little toddlers looking up to their mom. Did they fall? Should I cry here or whatever? But it's, after I have this outcome, things didn't go as well on the practice test or the actual first test. I look to my parents to figure out, how do I interpret this? And if the parents are okay, we got to double down on what we learn from this exact instance, talk about the behaviors, the connections, and what can we do different the next time. And so to make everything more of a scientific process of how do we keep improving this, versus really getting that sense of this disappointment or anything negative from the parents. So really having them be thoughtful, encouraging the students to be analytical and insightful about what was the experience like on this test.
Mm-hmm.
And talk about what happened. What was your experience like is really very, very powerful. And especially if things didn't line up, they expected to be here, turned out to be here. Well, let's talk about how was it different in the actual test versus the other test? What surprised you? Where were you ready? Where were you not ready? And really engage them in that intellectual manner, which is really an introspective kind of metacognitive component, versus coming of I'm disappointed that the score wasn't where you have to be here. You aren't even close. So really push them towards improvement and that kind of focus versus the other emotional part.
Many of us work with international students. I know we have many international counselors in both public and private schools, and working. And it, how do international, in your experience or the different tutoring that you are exposed to, how do international parents differ? Are there things do they add more pressure? Is it?
There are some cultural differences among parents. I was just writing this morning to a father who was from Asia, and there was a bit of a language concern. And obviously, he cares deeply about his son, but talking about the process and motivation, there was a slight disconnect in terms of the language differences. How do we talk about this piece? Culturally, for sure, there are more nurturing parents sometimes, and some really are from a higher pressure. We expect you to be here, and the outcome is really everything.
Mhm.
The performance is everything. And so, and my sense is, kids are kids, and ultimately, using the negative, using the fear-based stuff, using the, catastrophe outcome is not going to be beneficial. And that can eventually degrade their intrinsic motivation anyhow. And
Right.
so I really want to come from a place of coaching and support, whether the parents are from Colombia or from Taiwan or from Indonesia. And we have parents now from all over the globe, from the Saudis to the Jakarta. And the name of the game is being supportive, being and when there are differences, I still ask them to try to just do it our way and reinforce and be positive and build that way versus the negative kind of driving of
Mhm.
the
Oh,
actions.
I think that's really good advice and something that we can do as counselors in whatever capacities that we can encourage is to have that message for our students and our parents.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the SAT and the ACT itself, this has been such a pivotal
Mhm.
year.
Yeah.
I've been doing this 25 years. I've never seen so many changes in one year. And, and both the SAT and ACT made some changes.
Yeah.
I know you've done some research about that. So can you comment on some of these changes, what you're seeing now that some of the tests were a couple of tests dates down the road, and
Yeah.
what's having the biggest effect for students?
Sure thing. And the biggest news was obviously the overhaul last March of the SAT, when it was completely reoriented, realigned. They went directly towards imitation of the ACT. They integrated deeply the Common Core standards. One of the biggest changes was honestly with the mathematics, where the math questions are so different. We had to scrap our entire book, which we've used for the past 10 years, and write a whole brand new one based on this new Common Core math. And I was playing with the March and May math problems just last week, and it's amazing how critical reading comprehension is on this math test. And if you do any kind of careless reading, you're hosed, because you have to be so careful with the setup and the proper reading. And if you change or transpose one thing, or if you mess up the units and you don't convert the units properly, there's a wrong answer waiting for you. So I think the math change was the biggest on the SAT. The increase in level of difficulty of the reading. There's definitely higher level reading on the reading comprehension. There's now you have this new document-based question that was from an AP exam, AP language exam, which is the essay. The integration of some of the science components really wasn't that big of a deal.
Mhm.
They have a few charts and tables and graphs, but that really isn't throwing our kids off. And making the writing more passage-based doesn't change things that much either. For the ACT, we're seeing them just going deeper, actually going broader into mathematics. And now they're covering a broader and broader range of content, where they're going light into many, many different areas, from matrix multiplication to vertical asymptotes, to domains and ranges of functions. Now we're going to conic sections, having to have kids memorize the formula for an ellipse. Or there definitely there's more things to memorize for students on the ACT. Whereas the SAT really is narrowing their focus into this word problem world with a lot of algebra, a lot of there are functions, algebra 1 and 2, some chart, table, graph reading, and hints of geometry, but really it's secondary now. And so we have to really train kids differently on the math. Otherwise, the reading is similar, a little bit harder on the SAT. The writing and the English, profoundly similar in so many ways. Really, that's one of the easier sections for kids. And the science section on the ACT is getting harder. They've been pushing, I've been in the game for 15 years, and historically I would tell parents that the science section really isn't about science at all. It's about logic, reading skills, chart, table, graph skills, and so forth. But now they're pushing, whereas before there used to be 2 questions of 40 were about background knowledge of science. Now we're seeing 1 per passage. So we're seeing more than a 3-fold increase in the background knowledge they expect. And they're asking questions about your dependent variable versus your independent variable. They're asking questions about the design of experiments, hypothesis testing, control groups, flaws in the design of an experiment, as well as some other content in terms of chemistry, having certain background about equation writing. So they're definitely pushing the level of science, but they're not giving kids more time. And so our experience is that science section has never been speedier. and you have to be just faster than most kids go. And so that's one thing I don't like, but that's one thing how they're pushing it to make it harder and probably have kids miss more items. There were too many kids getting perfect scores and the drop was too steep. If you miss one, you're to 32. So now let's just make it harder by making it even speedier and more rigorous.
So, in terms of the new SAT and especially on the SAT and the scoring, we hear a lot of discussion about that, and people are talking about how the new scores seem like they're inflated. Right. What is your perspective on that as you've analyzed it? How does that look to you?
It has to do with the change in the test and the change in the scoring of the test. And if you look closely at the ACT, there's also a long tail on the left and things compress some to the right, where the mid score isn't an 18, it's closer to a 21, 22 on the ACT. There's some compression toward the right. And what's happened, when the SAT got rid of their guessing penalty, and when they dropped from 5 items, A, B, C, D, E as choices down to 4, all of a sudden you can guess your way to a higher score. So students can guess their way randomly to like a 350 or a 360, and that's pushing the middle to the right. Whereas the old SAT, the midpoint was a 500 on a given section. Now it seems like it's closer to a 540. So things are moving, it's compressing to the right, and that's shifting all the top scores. So if if a public school won a 1300 last year, well, now they want like a 1370. The school won a 1400 last year, now it's a 1450. So everything is moving up, and you have to make sure you're using new numbers and current numbers because, because the midpoint of the test went from 2 sections of being about 1,000, now it's being at 1080. So you have to be mindful of that and use charts and tables. Whereas like a 1580 is probably very close, but towards the middle, it starts to being shifted more.
So it sounds like now the SAT and ACT have become much more neck and neck in terms of, the scoring and their approaches.
Yeah. The College Board has been losing share to the ACT for a decade. And the ACT now is serving about 2/3 of American high school graduates. So the ACT has been leading, and the College Board's in catch-up mode. And so right now the gap this year could be 400,000 students greater, are taking the ACT compared to the SAT. So the College Board realigned their whole test, went from 10 sections down to 4. They dropped the guessing penalty. They added science. They're doing all, they made the essay at the end and optional like the ACT. In so many ways they're imitating. They deviate in terms of level of difficulty of the reading. They deviate in terms of the kind of math they're assessing and the rigor of the essay. But otherwise, the sections line up in terms of, their 4 blocks. It's so similar. And if you prep for one, you are de facto prepping for the other. I would say about 9/10 of content will transfer back and forth. So we're coming to like a point of convergence, like an agreement about what this test, should actually assess. We got rid of all the old advanced vocabulary, no more analogies, sentence completions. Now it's long-form reading. It's writing with focus on rhetorical skills as well as the grammar. It's now some science, fluency, and though math is the one area where we're still it's the one deviation that's still strong. But both the essays became more analytical and more rigorous too. So yeah, I think we're coming to a new world of assessments, and I think there is some kind of agreement. But still, there are slight differences, and those are big enough where some kids will do better on one or the other, especially based on timing or reading level. So my thing is always take a dual baseline of both, find your better test, and go with that one.
I think that's, and that's why starting the testing early enough that they can get that and not, hopefully, not be in that, excuse me, anxiety mode when they're trying, so that there's a little less pressure at that time. So
absolutely.
How are the colleges going to use? They know the old scores. They know that that 1,000 range. Now they've got the scores have shifted up. How are they going to use this? You're headed off to NACAC. I'm sure there'll be lots of people to talk to. So what do you think is happening in that regard?
They're going to have to rely upon the percentile tables where they're converting one to the other. And what was a 97% last year, here's the new one. And then the only challenge, there's been some real pushback on the part of the ACT when they did a concordance table. And the AC folks said this thing is utterly invalid, and we're converting it back on a 2006 study. The tests have changed. You can't say that. But until we have data on students taking both tests, and we're not going to be able to, to actually have a proper table. So right now we're going to be relying upon these old tables, and how valid they are, it's all we have to work with. So, but typically colleges, from what I've seen, they seem to be interested in and actually supportive of many of the changes. When they got rid of the advanced vocabulary, when they got rid of the really weak essay on the SAT, and they added an essay from the AP exam, which is obviously a much more respected, actually, it's really here, it's not make up stuff and you can, fabricate whatever you want. It's here's a document, analyze it. It's much more college-like. So we're seeing comments and quotes from Yale to other schools where they're in support of the changes. I think we're going to have to wait and see what happens with this admission cycle, but I think they're going to go pretty easy. They're not going to, if you have the old testing or the new testing, the most schools will take either or, and they'll simply use the concordance tables because that's all we have to work with. But I don't know. I feel like they're going to work with this, and ultimately, in the summer of 2018, we're going to have data regarding, is this new assessment better aligned with the college level curriculum? Is there a higher correlation between this test and performance as a first year in college? And my sense is it will be higher. I think the new assessment is actually a better one and is more college aligned. College Board did a pilot study which showed that this did have a meaningfully higher prediction of first year grades. So we'll see. That was only a 2,000 or so person study. So once we have 1 million kids plus, we'll have a lot more power in that analysis. But I just on face value and working with kids and analyzing it, it seems like this is actually the SAT is a better test. And the only thing I wish would happen is the folks at the ACT would give the kids more time to question. That's the one thing I really dislike, how they privilege speed, which really is not a major factor in college performance. And because whenever you give kids more time on the ACT, they always do better, especially in the science section. And so we'll see if they change it over time.
True. That's for sure. They're going to look at it and then adjust it. We have all these new scores on the SAT in particular. All these little subscores.
Subscores, yeah.
And subscores of subscores.
Right.
I'm not really sure how much the college is going to care about all the two-digit scores and all these breakouts and history, science, and all that.
They're weak. And honestly, anything that touches a science topic or content, they're calling it a science question. So, which is honestly disingenuous. I mean, if there's something about a science reading, that's not measuring your science fluency. And a math problem which mentions something scientific, they're calling it a science question, which is really, not authentic. That's not good stuff. And the subscores, in my understanding, are really for the high schools. The subscores the admissions officers won't pay much mind to them. But in terms of when they're aligning things with the Common Core standards, if they're trying to figure out how have we done as a high school to prepare our kids for these Common Core, metrics and standards, that feedback could go to the departments, the language department, the math department, the English teachers, and so forth. But I think in admissions, they're not going to give much time, if any at all, to those new 20 subscores. I mean, it's fancy, you have a longer, sheet, but there's not much utility for a college admissions officer in that regard.
Okay, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Makes total sense. Then the last question I have is on the ACT, and it seems like there's a little bit of controversy on the scoring of the writing. Can you comment on that?
They backed off the writings. The writing last year was a brand new assessment, and it was going to be every grader was going to give points, 4 different scales, 6 points apiece. So 24 points per writer, a total of 48 points total, which would scale to 36. They were grading it, though, more rigorously than ever before with these new scales. And so the average grade wasn't like a 2021 out of 36, where most of the other 4 scores fall for math, science, English, writing. But they were falling around like 17. So they were falling below, and the midpoint was roughly a 17 or a 16.7. And so people were upset that their scores were lower. They didn't, it wasn't very clear this was on its own scale. And there was real controversy that when people had their scores hand scored, they applied for a regrade. The scores often moved, and sometimes dramatically. We had one of our tutors, his score went from a 24 to a 33. And one student in the Atlantic magazine, he went up from a 19 to a 31. And if an admissions grader can't differentiate between a 31 and a 19, that totally threatens the validity of the whole essay exercise. So just recently, in the past 2 months, they said, all right, forget it. We're backing away from our harder scale. Now each grader has to simply give a score of 1 to 6, like in the old days. So now your top score is 12, your bottom score is 2. We expect scores in the 8, 9, 10, 11 region. And they also, for the first time ever, they've gone forth and said, we are no longer doing the hand grading. So you can't apply. It'll be in my newsletter tomorrow, matter of fact. But that's something we learned recently, that if you give them $40, they can make sure that your essay was in fact graded, but they're not going to submit that to regrading by somebody else. They're going to trust it, because that was causing problems and issues of access, because before you had to wager $50 to get that hand scoring. And if it came back in your favor, the money came back to you. But if not, you were out that money. And so they were saying that would privilege the more affluent people. And so they also, when scores move that dramatically, it did threaten the validity of the exercise. So now they're putting up more of an opaque wall, and you can't see inside. And you still can't get the essays back as an individual, which to me is a problem. I mean, the College Board, from day one, they gave you back your essay back in March of 2005. And here, like, the schools can petition for that, but individuals can't see their essays, which I don't like that either. I'm all about transparency in that regard.
Well, that gives us definitely, as counselors and advisors, some helpful information that we know as we're working with students, and then also helps us as we tailor our comments and our recommendations in terms of what students to look at. And I know from the admission side, people are, they might have their composite is like in the 30s and their essay is coming out as 19. I've seen that too.
Right.
And it's like the colleges know there's a discrepancy there. They understand, right. They know what's going on in the space. So I think for the next few years, they're going to look at those essays take them with a grain of salt.
Exactly right. And then so many have come forth and said they're going to be optional until they have data. My sense, and you have many schools who said, you know what, we ran correlations on the old essays to the freshman GPA, and they were very low. But my sense is, like for the SAT especially, this new essay is an AP language document, and it's tested for 30 some years. This thing should be more valid. And so I think I wouldn't be surprised if in a few years we see colleges come back and actually require it. So I think this will be a better predictor. If we can do this exercise, this AP language test, you'll probably be more inclined to be ready for freshman English. So, but that again, we need data, which will be the summer of 18. We'll have our first round of data.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we recently had the University of California Counselors Conference not too far from me, and the president of the University of California system was there, and so he opened it up for a round of questions. So I posed the question based on the same testing information. The writing, there's some questions and issues, especially on the ACT. Many colleges are going optional. What do with the University of California, is it considering going optional? And he basically said there's no way the UC would go optional on the writing. It's a faculty-driven requirement.
Yeah.
And so I think that was very insightful. It was very interesting because we do know many, even prestigious schools, are going optional on the writing. So
that's right.
I thought it was interesting that it was very unequivocal that no, we're going to continue requiring it. Yeah. So
and there's still one other use of the essay that if there is ever any uncertainty regarding the authenticity of their college admissions essay, and this is a writing sample to see, could the student who wrote this in half an hour, 45 minutes, have written this given 10 hours? And if these things are too far apart, that they can then view that essay in a whole different light if the kid got way too much help. So that's one reason why there's still utility, even if it's not as good for the grading of it, but just seeing a timed writing sample of a student.
Well, and don't some of the schools use it for placement, as you said, to for their English placement? So that's value in that too. Yeah. So, well, Jed, thank you very much. This has been very insightful. I know our students will really appreciate your words of insight and advice, and just the comprehensiveness and helping our students manage the stress and anxiety. I know that's a really key thing, and helping them to know what they're coming up against, and you do that very, very well. So thank you very much. We appreciate having you with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.